Hi there everybody, we've done all the audio and checks, so we're going to start our webinar today looking at technical packs. My name is Vicky and I'm from createafashionbrand.com, and I've been working in the fashion industry for about 20 years now, building many brands and new businesses and helping other people to kind of expand and move forward with their fashion business. So you can get a hold of me any of these ways, and there'll be the website at the end of the presentation. So let's get on to what is a tech pack. So a tech pack is, some people call it a technical pack. It basically tells people how to make a product that you want. You're telling a factory, you're giving them a blueprint basically of what fabric to use, how to make it, where you want the details, what size it's going to be, if there's any prints or embroideries or any other detailing on it. You're giving them ultimately a step-by-step kind of instruction manual on what to do with the information and what to do with that piece of fabric when they get it. It's got its own special language in terms of how you write things and the references and terminology. It's also got its own special way of drawing the flat drawings, which we'll cover it in a little bit. And you also tell them any special details like measurements or trims or anything that you might need to get from a drawing to an actual product. Now, the reason that people actually need one, a lot of people try and get around this by doing sketches and just handing them to maybe friends or a dressmaker that you might know. It never quite turns out the way you think it's going to turn out. So we'll go into the reasons why you actually need one. When you go into retail, it's very different from making clothes at home. And there's a very different way of measuring, there's a very different way of talking about all the elements that you're going to use, there's different terminology, there's lots of different things that are involved. There's also issues that you probably haven't thought of, like tax, law, customs, exports, and all different parts of the business when you're creating a product. Now, you probably won't think about these when you're designing, but they will come into the manufacturing for you later on. And it's really important, especially when we're talking about copyright, which I'll cover, that you actually have a tech pack, because what this will do is it will cover you if you've got a beautiful product and someone tries to copy it later on. You've got some evidence there if it gets to a point where you have to go to court or anything like that. You've got a big long process and list of emails and documentation to show that you are in the right, it's your design, and you should be the one credited with the finance and the revenue. So the other elements, just covering why we really need one, it does actually reduce cost. I've had a lot of clients that have come to me and they know people that have factories, or they can make samples for them, and they maybe not the best drawers, things like that, and they'll go in with a sketch and ask someone to make it. The samples that will come back are always never what they think is going to come back and never what they've asked for. So a tech pack will actually reduce the cost by giving a factory or a sample maker an exact set of instructions in a particular language with very precise measurements and points of measurement, which will then reduce your cost, because rather than doing 5 or 6 samples throughout the process, you should really only do 1 or 2 maximum. So in terms of the sampling cost and the fabric cost that will go into sampling and things like that, it reduces the cost down throughout your entire process. It keeps things very simple for a factory. With a lot of people now, they're going to factories overseas, abroad, and And sometimes you don't always have the option of speaking the same language, but a tech pack is done in a very specific way, including the way it's drawn, the way it's laid out, and the language that's used, and that's a universal language across the world. Now, even with the drawings themselves, which we'll have a little look at in a bit, the line weight, the actual thickness of the lines, mean different things as well. The way that it's drawn will mean different things. So there's a very specific way of laying it out and drawing it, and the things that you write down, that will tell a factory, regardless of language, how to make your product. Now, sometimes factories can make mistakes. This does happen. And if there is a mistake, as there is with law and any legal issues, you have an entire process, a documentation paper trail through all of the tech packs and amendments and emails that you've made, that will give you the right to make sure that your finance is covered. If you have any claims against the factory, you've got this documentation, this paperwork that says, this is what I asked for, this is what you've given me, they don't match up, I gave you this piece of information, and unfortunately you are in the wrong. So you can ask then the factory to remake the products if you need to, or correct any issues that you might have. As I said in the introduction a little bit earlier on, it makes sure that you're not a victim of copyright fraud. If somebody tries to copy your design, you should always have a date on your tech pack, and of course all your emails and your paperwork. You can make sure that if you do have to go to court, or you want to file a claim against someone, that you have all of this documentation sitting there ready, and they can't say, well, we designed this first, because you've got the dates of everything, you've got the agreements with the factory, you've got all of this stuff that says very, very clearly and precisely, this is what I've designed, this is my product, and you've actually copied my product. So it protects you in terms of law as well. Now, in terms of customers, which is really what we're all designing for and putting our products together for, it makes sure that things are consistent as well. When you're doing a range, and you're going to do lots of different ranges, every season you'll come up with something new, it makes sure that if you're designing something quite similar to a previous product, you can have a look at that product, make sure that the next product has a similar set of measurements, that the customers are then happy because they bought your items before, they love what you've produced, and they can just say, right, yes, that's my size, I know that'll fit me really well, the last one fitted me perfectly, and they have no problems in purchasing a new item. It also means that if you're trying things on, or maybe if you've got complaints from customers that maybe something's tight or doesn't fit in a particular area, you've also got that feedback, and you can then, the next set of designs, you can address that issue, you can change some of the items that you've got, because you've got all of those records sitting there ready to be used. So let's have a look at actually what goes into a tech pack itself. This is a tech pack that I've just thrown together. It's a fake one. The MF brand is my fake brand. And I've put together all of the sheets just so that you've got something to look at here. And we're going to go through each of them individually and have a little close-up of each one. So the first one, the cover sheet. Now this sometimes sounds a bit silly to people. They kind of think, well, why do I need this cover sheet? But if you think about holding all of your tech packs, if you're going to print them out, or even if you've got them online or in the cloud or somewhere on a server, it's actually very difficult to find. Trust me, when you've got thousands and thousands of these things sitting on a computer somewhere, you do need something that's going to be very large and makes it very easy for you to find, so you can get to the files really, really quickly. So this is your cover sheet. Very, very simple. It has an image of the garment that you're going to cover and just some basic details. We've got the sample size there at the top, the style number, a small description, the date, and some fabric references, just for a quick reference guide. And this is all the information that you really should have on it. Like we said, the date, style number, and description. The logo of your brand is quite important, especially for any legal issues that might come up later on. You have to make sure that you've got your logo or something on there for legal purposes. If you've got multiple designers working for you across different products or areas, I would also recommend that you get them to put their name on each one as well, just so you've got something to refer back to. And then obviously a large image of the garment. Doesn't have to necessarily be a technical drawing at this point, but I always would find it easier just to copy the two across. It cuts down a lot of work for people. And I would put it in colour, because all the other sheets and all the other drawings will be in black and white, just so that all the details are very, very clear. So this one would hold your colour picture as well. Now these are technical drawings that I've pulled off a couple of websites, a couple of fashion websites. Any of you that might know WGSN, these are actually from there. And these are not technical drawings. People get very confused between what is a technical drawing and what isn't. These are really what I would call illustrations. They look quite flat, but there's a lot of movement marks in here, lots of gathering shapes, lots of bits of shading and things, and they're also in colour, which you wouldn't really do on a technical drawing either. So we're going to have a look at technical drawings, and that will go into your spec and details, which are the next 2 pages. So your spec basically tells someone at the factory how the end product should look, and this is how we tell them how to make that product to your exact specifications. This is a bit more of a close-up. We've got the same product as we had on the front cover here. You'll notice, as I said, it's in black and white, but this has been given a colour because it's a contrast fabric. And if we look at the fabrics up here, you've got the original fabrics with a little tiny square there of how they're represented on this particular page. And you've got all your factory references for the fabrics themselves. You've got your sample size, so they know what reference to use in terms of measurements. Same as the cover page, you've got your style number, a description, your date. But this is where you start to put all of your actual information. So you've got your materials up here, and the information for the fabric itself, the factory that it comes from with any kind of reference number. If there's a contrast fabric, we repeat that again, so you've got the same details. You then have things like the thread and all the finishings, so how the hem will be finished. On this one we've said a twin needle. Same with the cuff, how that would be finished, what buttons to use. And down here, which sometimes confuses people, I've written 2 measurement sizes. You've got 19mm and something called line. It's pronounced line. It's a French word, and it actually is the measurement of buttons, which a lot of people don't realise. So on a proper tech pack, I wouldn't have the millimetres in here. I would only have that one measurement, the 30 line, because it refers, each line number refers to a specific width, a specific measurement of a button. But you can find all this information quite easily online, and we have it also on the website in our resources and blog page. So if you ever need the resources for this, don't worry, it's all on there. And then of course you have your measurements. Now this here is really just a summary. You've got, you know, cuff to hem, depending on where you're measuring from and to, make things very, very specific, but it's basically a summary. A lot of people try and make this written part the focus of their tech pack. I always advise against that, mainly because, again, if you're dealing with people in other countries and maybe there's a difference in language, the easiest thing for them to see, most people will understand numbers, So if they've got a specific point from here to here, as you can see, we've got the red lines there and a very specific point of measurement with a number. That's the thing that they will concentrate on, and that's what they will look at. So I would always make this part, this main design part, the focus of your tech pack. You'll always get better results if you focus on the drawing part rather than the information part. And then we go into all the little details. You have to put a measurement on absolutely everything, because the only thing, if you forget to do something, the factory will just come back and ask you. So if you remember to put them all on from the beginning, you'll have a lot less emails, a lot less issues, and the samples will hopefully come back to your specification first time round. So even to the point here, I've got measurements for the pockets, I've got measurements for the tab here that's on the sleeve, and you might have to even go to the point of telling them how it's constructed. So in this case, I've shown them it's a rollback sleeve, so I've shown them that the sleeve is extended here, and then on here I've shown them that the tab rolls back the sleeve and attaches with the button. So you have to think of all sorts of different things. Don't assume just because they're a factory that they will understand, or that someone is a dressmaker and they understand pattern cutting. You have to make sure you're putting everything on it, and the way that I explain it to people is do it as though you're explaining it to, I don't know, a child. It's probably the easiest way to explain, just so you make sure you have every bit of information on there that you might possibly need. So I've just done a quick close-up here of one of the drawings. As you can see, we've got all the dotted lines here. I've been very, very precise on where the dotted lines are, because that is where they will measure. That is where the factory will take your measurements and they will create a pattern specifically around where your dotted lines are. So they have to be very specific. It sounds a little silly. You would think that people would go, oh, it's a little bit out, it means this. But trust me, you need to be very, very specific with where you put your lines. If things are quite difficult, like I've done here at the bottom, I always just make sure that there are points referencing each part of the measurement. I've put the 6 centimeters here at the bottom of the button stand to show that this extra little bit here is 6 centimeters, and then the button stand here is 3. So just try and make sure that everything's very clearly laid out and everything's measured very, very clearly as well. So just as a quick recap, you should have the key information as before, the fabric information, the garment trims and details, the large image of your garment with the measurements, and remember to make sure that that is the focus. It must be a technical drawing, it must have measurement points, and any other details that you might want to put in. Now I'll quickly say, I suppose we didn't really cover the technical drawing itself and why it's slightly different, so I'll just pop back to this one. If you look at this drawing here, the way that I've done it, these lines here are a little bit thinner than these stitch lines. Now the reason for this is because that's a seam line. Anything that has a thicker weight line is a seam. Anything with a thinner weight line will be stitches. Now there doesn't have to be necessarily a specific weight of line, as long as you have a thicker line for the seams and a thinner line for any stitch details, anything like that. So anything that's not a seam, make sure it's a smaller weight line. I hope that all makes sense. Now the way we do a technical drawing is sometimes what we call a flat drawing, and the reason for that is that it basically, if you take any garment and put it flat on a table or on the floor or something where it is completely flat, that is how you draw the garment. Now obviously for things like shirts, I like to always open the collar a little bit, or make sure that something is open, as we did with the sleeve. One of them is out, one of them is rolled up, but basically how it would look if the garment was laid flat. So when people put in a lot of movement lines or shading and things like that, it can cause problems later on when your garment comes back. I was actually working with someone who was a big fan of, this was years ago, big fan of doing very beautiful illustrations, and they were beautiful, they were lovely, but we had a skirt made for this large retailer, and she'd done this beautiful shading and movement lines and draping everywhere, and when the sample came back, the factory had dip dyed the skirt because they assumed that all the shading for the movement, and it was at the top of the skirt, was a detail on the fabric. So they actually dip dyed the entire batch of production of skirts. And this must, I don't know how much this cost, but this was right at the end of the production stage. And it must have cost the retailer hundreds of thousands of US dollars. So the reason I bang on about technical drawings so much is to make sure that you don't have those issues. So please make sure that you do these properly. If you're not sure about how to do them, you can hire a designer, and we'll cover that a little bit later on after we've gone through the other pages. So let's just skip on to the last couple of sheets. This is the sampling sheet. Now, a lot of people don't put these in, but again, as we were talking about the legal issues and measurements, stuff like that, I always like to put one of these in every single tech pack, because what will happen is you'll get your first sample, and like many different manufacturers and sample makers, the first one always has a few measurements that are slightly off. Regardless of what you've put on your technical sheet, there will always be a couple that might have to be changed. So I like to put one of these in. So we'll have a look at a slightly larger one. We've got all of our information up here again. Style number, date of course, the size for your sample, fabric. You've got all of your measurement points down here. The first column is your sample, so that's the one that you're going to sample in. And then you've got the first sample actual measurement. So, I mean, these are all dummy numbers, so I've just popped in a couple that are slightly different here. But basically, when you get your first sample back, you have to do something called QA. You have to do your quality assurance. And that's basically where you take your technical pack, or someone in your team takes your technical pack, and you measure each of those points yourself. Now, the factory might do this for you, and they will quite often write on top of your technical pack, but you must do this yourself, because you'll be surprised how different the measurements might sometimes be. So just to make sure that all of your points are measured correctly and they're all correct from what you've asked for to what's actually come back in the sample, you should be measuring all of these points like you would if you're working in the factory. Okay, and then what you would do is you would pop all the information in this part here. Now, sometimes there's what we call tolerance for every measurement. For most measurements, if they're large measurements like a bust or waist, we have about 0.5 centimeters, and that will give some kind of allowance to the factory to be within those lines. Anything outside of that, you really have to go back to the factory and say, this was my measurement, I need you to get it to this measurement if possible. But there is a slight tolerance allowed. So it's up to you how much tolerance you allow your factory for every measurement. I would advise that for smaller things like a neck width or cuff opening or something like that, that is a small amount of size, a small width or a small length, that you make that tolerance smaller. So maybe within 2 or 3 millimeters really to what you're asking for. But that can work either side. So for 98, for example, on the cuff hem to cuff hem, that, because it's a long measurement from cuff to cuff, it's actually come back as 80, but I would allow a centimetre on that. So it could either come back as 99 or 97, and that would be acceptable to me as the designer. Because it's come back at 80, I would then go back to the factory and say, you need to get this back to 98. Please make sure on the next sample that it's 98. And then again, on the next sample, you should be checking them, making sure as you go through that every single measurement is correct. Now, it might be that you have a fit model, and we'll talk about fit models in a bit. But if you've got a fit model and you decide actually you want to change one of these measurements, you can do that, but then you need to make sure that you update your information on this sheet, and in the next sample that comes back as 80 and you've specified that you want to change it to 80. There has to be, I mean, you know what you're asking for, you know how this whole thing is going through the process, but you have to make sure for legal reasons that everything is documented and very, very clearly stated for every single stage. It sounds like a pain, I know, but believe me, you'll have 20 samples that will be perfectly fine, and then someday, at some point, there'll be one sample that will happen and you'll need the documentation for it. So please make sure that when you're doing these, you do keep accurate records for everything. Okay. So let's just skip over. This is basically the outline as to how samples would work usually in retail. So you have your tech pack, you've made your tech pack, you've given it to the factory, and you get your first sample back. This is your initial sample that comes back. You would then fit the sample, measure it, QC it, make some comments, and send those comments back to the factory. If you're perfectly happy, then you can move on to production and your size set. If you're not happy, then you might have to do a second sample. And this would just keep going onto a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, depending on how many samples you needed to get your product to what you wanted it to look like. Now, if you were competent in your tech pack, if it was done properly first time round, for most retailers, they would accept 2 samples maximum. The second sample that comes back should be bang on, correct, ready for production. Any more than that, and you've got a problem with how you're doing your tech packs or possibly your factory. After that happens, and you should be agreeing, signing off each of the samples with your factory as they happen. When you're happy, you then go to what's called a size set. Now this is a full set of samples at every size. So you'd get a size 8, size 10, size 12, you know, depending on what sizes you were doing for that product, you would ask for a full set of sizes, which is called a size set. Then the last sample you would get is something called a pre-production sample. Now, this is, people do this 2 different ways. You can either ask for a final sample to sign off, to check over, to QC, make sure that the colour is right, the fabric's right, all the details are right, and then sign that off before they start production. What a lot of people do when they've got a good relationship with their factory or they've used them for a long time, this will be just taken out of the bulk production. So as the factory is making your order, whether that's 20 or 100 or whatever, they will make an extra one to send to you. And it's just taken out of the bulk production at random and sent to you, just so you have a record of what's going to come later on. So this is your sampling sheet, just summary. All the key information that we had on all of the sheets, all of the measurement points written down with the sample size, and then a space to record each sample measurement as they come back. Okay. So the last sheet we're going to cover is something called a grading sheet. Now this is to do with the size set that we were talking about. This tells a factory what sizes you need for every single size. And it's mainly used in production for larger orders. So if you're doing large scale where, I don't know, you might be wholesaling out to a retailer or something like that, anything really where you've got over 50 pieces at multiple sizes, I would always send them very specific sizes myself. You can get away with just sending them what's called a grading rule, but they will work that out. Anything larger than that, I would always send a grading sheet. I always think it's better to do that anyway, but of course that is up to you. So we'll just have a quick look at what they are. It looks exactly the same really as the sampling sheet. You've got your sample size here at the beginning. You've got all your measurement points, all the key information again. And then you've got all of your sizes. Up there at the top, we've got 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. And you've got a set of measurements for every single measurement point, for every single size. It's specific to each size. Now this plus minus at the end, this is what's called a grading rule. This tells a factory, for example, if you wanted to then go up to an 18 or down to a 6, this would tell them how many centimeters to put on or take off the standard measurements that you've given them to make another size. So if we look at the top one here, the cuff hem to cuff hem, you've got at size 8, you've got 80 centimeters from one to the other. Our plus minus is 6, that's our grading rule, and that means as we go up the sizing or we go down the sizing, we're adding or taking off 6 centimeters each time. So as you can see here, it goes 80, 86, 98, 80, 86, well, all made up, but you can see they're 86. You just keep adding on 6 each time or taking off 6 each time. And obviously you have to make sure that your sample size and your 12 UK, because we're doing 12 as a sample, those should be exactly the same as well. There's a lot of people that sometimes send things and they're different, so you do have to make sure that all your measurements are right. This is just a mock-up, so obviously I haven't kind of filled in all of them, but you can see from these ones at the front here, I've just added in all of the grading rules, and that works exactly the same for every measurement point. Now you'll also notice that all the different points have different grading rules, and there will be some that you might not want to change. Things like the placket width, which is the button stand, some people call it, where the buttons go. That wouldn't necessarily change size as you had bigger or smaller sizes, so that wouldn't have a grading rule. As you can see there, it's 2.5 all the way along, or 3 all the way along. The collar, again, might stay the same, but this is of course down to your design and how you want to change your sizing. So just make sure that all of your measurement sizes are written down at every measurement point. Now I should quickly just say, with measurements and tech packs, we measure flat. With a lot of dressmaking, and anyone who's done this already will know this already, but with dressmaking, a lot of people will measure everything round. So things like the waist, they'll measure the full waist all the way around the body, or the hips, or the chest. In production, we always measure flat because we give a front view and we give a back view on our tech packs. So all of the measurements are just for the front on the front sketch and just for the back on the back sketch. So make sure you're doing all of your measurements what we call flat. Okay, so just a quick summary. The grading sheet should have, same as before, date, style number, the logo obviously, and the spreadsheet of every measurement point and the measurements per size. Now this is something called the chicken or the egg. This is carrying on from measurements. People get very confused, and I've had a lot of people ask me about fit models and whether you go with standard sizes first or you go with your own set of measurements. And I've called this kind of the chicken or the egg issue, because you need an egg from a chicken for the chicken to be born, but you also need the chicken to lay the egg, so we don't know which one. What do we do first? Well, it can be a little bit tricky, but if you are going to have a fit model, with them you need someone to measure on, a real person. And people obviously are not dummies. They do move and they breathe and they, change, and they've all got different measurements. So you need someone to test your products on, but then you also have standard retail measurements. These are reliable measurements that have been put together by the fashion industry by literally just taking hundreds of thousands of women's or men's or kids' measurements. And what they do then is they take an average of those measurements to the top 75% of the population. Everybody's different, so you're never going to please everybody, but this will always be a fairly average size set of measurements. So you've got the option of the two. With a fit model, you'd need to create a particular size for that one person. That fit model should be your average customer. So if you're doing plus size, if you're doing maybe pregnancy, your model has to be plus size or pregnant. If you're doing it for a specific reason or a specific type of person, your fit model again has to be the average of your customer. So when you're choosing your fit models, you have to make sure that this is your average customer, really. But like I said, everybody's different. So how do you know if this is the average size of your customers? On the other hand, you've got the standard measurements. We already know they're the average. But again, if you're doing something like pregnancy, for example, at some point your fit model's not going to be pregnant. So you are going to have to make sure that the next person you get in has the exact measurements for the model that you had previously. So you have to kind of balance up all the different options. Now, this is the problem when you start to get into production, and these are the questions that I usually get asked. Do you get a model first and create your own set of measurements, or do you just purely go with the standard measurements and find a model who fits that size? Well, I would always say concentrate on the standard measurements, mainly because they are an average and the information has already been put together for you. This has already been done by the fashion industry, and they've gone around and they've already measured thousands and thousands of people, so they know that these are the averages. I would make my first sample using the standard measurements. Then if you need to adapt them, if you've got some kind of special thing about your product, maybe it's a particular shape, maybe it's for a particular, I don't know, sports, that you need something to be smaller or larger, I would then adapt them at that point and then find a fit model to fit those measurements that you specifically need, because there are millions of fit models and you will always find somebody with the measurements that you require. That probably sounds really bizarre, but you will. There are hundreds of thousands of people across the world who will be able to fit the measurements that you require yourself. So I would always do it in that order if you're thinking about fit models and getting someone to physically try on your products. So for the last little bit, we'll just go through a couple of details really. Petite. Now some people get very confused about what petite actually is. Petite is not about size, it's actually about height. Petite actually covers anyone who's 5'3" to 4 inches and under. So petite is not about being a tiny, small size. It's to do with the way that you do your length on your technical sheets. As well, if you're putting these on labeling for your products, make sure that your terminology is correct. The petite will only refer to length, not width. Plus size refers to width only, and it usually covers women who are over what we would call average size. In the UK, that's a size 18 and up. It's 16 in the US and 44 for Euro sizes. These also require, like Petite, their own grading rules and their own measurements. So if you are doing tech packs or you're trying to hire a designer or have a designer, they need to understand that that is very, very different to the average set of grading rules and measurement rules. So make sure that you are getting your information from someone who understands the difference between all of these different things. Now, not all fashion designers are trained to do technical packs. It does depend on where you're getting your designer from. Some people might be designing themselves, that's fantastic. But if you are asking somebody to create a tech pack for you, because either you don't understand how this works, or maybe you've got someone to do it for you, or somebody else is doing the design, look at their CV very carefully and look at their experience very carefully. If they've worked for some very big retailers and things like that, that's great. But you need to look at what their experience was. If they've never put tech packs together themselves, that would be a red flag to me. If they've never worked directly with any manufacturers or have any supply experience at all, again, I'd be maybe asking some questions about if they knew how to put tech packs together. Because what you'll find is with big retailers, they have different departments to do different things. So the designer part in a big retailer, they just design. They don't actually do the manufacturing. That's left to the QC people and all the garment techs. So it's a very, very different job. So if you are thinking about fashion designers, those are the things I would maybe look for in their CVs, just so you know you're getting someone who does understand how to put them together. Now, there are also some specialisms. Again, if you're thinking about designers in particular, anything that covers knitwear, denim, tailoring, underwear, anything like that, there's a lot of different bits and pieces involved to do with the manufacturing and to do with the equipment and how the garments are put together. An average designer, if you've gone into women's wear, for example, and you're doing dresses or anything like that, I wouldn't ask them to do knitwear because they don't understand how the garments are put together properly. In the same way, you wouldn't ask a knitwear designer to do denim because denim has lots of different washes, chemicals involved, and all sorts of different processes that somebody else might not understand. It also makes a difference to how you size the garments, believe it or not. Anything with a stretch fabric like knitwear, jersey, has a smaller size than anything woven because of the different blocks that are used in manufacturing. So again, I would make sure if you are looking at hiring a designer or you want to design yourself, I would always make sure if somebody's doing a tech pack that they also have that specialism, if you need it, in their experience, that they are experienced in doing tech packs for that area. Okay, now if you can make clothes, that is fantastic. Anyone who can do that, I always think it improves your skills as a designer immensely because you understand how clothing is put together and what you can achieve and what's possible and what isn't. But if you're trying to put a tech pack together based on pattern cutting books or websites, I would strongly recommend against this. Never rely on the measurement points from pattern cutting books or websites or anything like that. The measurement points are very, very different when you're making one garment, and that's how these things are designed. It's for you to sit at home with a sewing machine, take your own measurements and measure yourself and make one garment, whereas retail doesn't do that, and they measure very, very differently. The production is very different, and the blocking that they use is very different, and how they put everything together is very, very different. So again, if your experience is with dressmaking at home, I would still advise you to go and maybe ask advice from someone who can do tech packs for retail and manufacturing. Software. Now, in the last few years, there are a few people that I've met that are trying to put tech pack software together. It generally doesn't work, mainly because software is built on maths and rules and things like that. But tech packs, a lot of it is down to experience and knowledge. And you need the knowledge of different fabrics, different movements, how they behave, how they stretch or don't stretch. And that can change depending on whether they're printed or whether you're going to embroider on top of them, or, you know, all these different things come with experience. And unfortunately, computers just can't work through all of that information, because to put all of that information into one software program would take 10, 20 years, and by that point everything would have updated anyway. So the reason that there's no really good software for this is just because it's a little bit impossible. Like trying to find an experienced designer, you're relying on a basic template that's designed for everybody to use, or a program that, you know, anyone can come in and put some information in, without the understanding and the knowledge of all of the other bits that will have an effect on your garments. So it's an okay, if you know what you're doing, if you're experienced in doing this, software might make it helpful to keep them all in one place, or make it easy to lay out all of the different things that you need to lay out, all of the sheets, putting all the information together. But I would only ever really suggest using them if you know how to do tech packs and you're just trying to save time, or you want to give access to them, I don't know, to a factory or a member of staff, something like that. But if you're new to this, I really wouldn't suggest using them. I would always recommend at least seeking advice. You don't necessarily have to pay someone to put the packs together, but at least go and ask somebody and get some advice for some people who are experienced.